Miami Beach, Florida, February 1964. Two men sat by a hotel pool at 3 in the morning, both at crossroads that would define the rest of their lives. One was Cassius Clay, 22 years old, about to fight Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship of the world and about to announce his conversion to Islam. The other was Little Richard, 31 years old, trying to be a gospel singer after abandoning rock and roll, married to a woman but tortured by desires he couldn't pray away. Nobody knows exactly how they ended up talking that night. Some say it was a chance meeting, others say Clay sought Richard out specifically. But what is known is that they talked for 4 hours straight, and when the sun came up over Miami Beach, both men had changed. Clay would become Muhammad Ali, and Little Richard would understand something about himself that he'd spend the next 40 years trying to articulate. Years later, Richard would say that conversation was the turning point of his life, but he never said what Ali told him. Until now, nobody knew what really happened by that pool. Before we dive into this untold story of two legends at their breaking points, hit that subscribe button. What happened that February night changed both their lives forever, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Two men at the edge. To understand what happened by that pool, you have to understand where both men were in February 1964. Cassius Clay was staying at the Hampton House, a blacks-only hotel in Miami's Overtown neighborhood, training for what everyone said would be his suicide mission, fighting Sonny Liston, the most feared heavyweight champion in boxing history. Liston had demolished opponents with a brutality that made even seasoned fighters nervous. The odds makers had Clay as a 7-1 underdog. The press called him a loudmouth kid who was about to get destroyed. But Clay knew something nobody else did. He was about to transform, to become someone entirely different, to shed the name given to him by slave owners and take on an identity that would make him the most controversial athlete in American history. Little Richard was in Miami for a gospel concert, part of his desperate attempt to save his soul by abandoning everything that had made him famous. For 4 years since that night in Australia when he'd seen the airplane engine catch fire and interpreted it as God's warning, Richard had been trying to be Brother Richard, a Seventh-day Adventist gospel singer who wore conservative suits and sang hymns instead of screaming into microphones with makeup running down his face. He'd married Ernestine Campbell in 1959, trying to prove he could live a conventional heterosexual life. He'd enrolled in Oakwood College to study theology. He'd renounced rock and roll as the devil's music and thrown his jewelry into the ocean as a symbol of his commitment to God, but it wasn't working. The marriage to Ernestine was a disaster. They barely spoke, barely touched, existed in the same house like strangers forced into an arrangement neither wanted. Richard's gospel career was financially stable but spiritually suffocating. The conservative church communities he performed for were suspicious of him, uncomfortable with his mannerisms, his history, the way he couldn't completely suppress the flamboyance that was as much a part of him as breathing. And underneath everything, Richard was still fighting the same battle he'd fought his entire life, the battle between who he was and who he thought God wanted him to be. The desires hadn't gone away. Richard still felt attraction to men, still felt the pull toward feminine expression, still felt most alive when he was performing in ways that transcended traditional masculinity. He'd tried to pray it away, tried to suppress it through marriage and gospel music and theological study. But suppression isn't the same as transformation, and Richard was slowly dying inside, suffocating under the weight of trying to be someone he fundamentally wasn't. So when Cassius Clay and Little Richard met that February night, whether by chance or by design, they were both men standing at precipices, both wrestling with questions of identity and authenticity, and the price you pay for being yourself in a world that demands conformity. And what happened in their conversation would illuminate something that both men had been avoiding. Sometimes salvation doesn't come from denying who you are, but from accepting it. The Hampton House encounter. The Hampton House was more than just a hotel. It was a cultural landmark, one of the few places in segregated Miami where black celebrities could stay with dignity. Sam Cooke had performed there, Martin Luther King Jr. had stayed there, Malcolm X was there that February, part of Cassius Clay's inner circle, preparing the young fighter for his transformation into Muhammad Ali. The atmosphere was electric with possibility and danger. The civil rights movement was reaching a crescendo. Clay's upcoming fight had captured national attention, and the rumors about his conversion to Islam were starting to leak to the press. Little Richard arrived at the Hampton House late on the evening of February 20th. He'd finished his gospel concert earlier that night, sung hymns to a politely appreciative crowd, felt the familiar emptiness that came from performing music that didn't move him the way rock and roll had. Someone from his tour, accounts vary on who exactly, mentioned that Cassius Clay was staying at the hotel, training for the Liston fight. Richard had met Clay briefly once before at some industry event, but they hadn't really talked. Still, Richard was curious. Clay represented something Richard understood, a black performer who refused to play by white America's rules, who was loud and confident and unapologetically himself. What happened next depends on whose version you believe. Some people who were there that night say Richard sought Clay out, asked around until he found which room the fighter was in. Others say Clay heard Richard was at the hotel and sent someone to invite him to talk. Still others claim it was pure chance, that they ran into each other in the hotel lobby late at night when both men couldn't sleep. What everyone agrees on is that around 3 in the morning, Cassius Clay and Little Richard ended up sitting by the hotel pool, alone except for the distant sound of traffic and the humid Miami air. Clay spoke first, not the brash, confident persona he showed the press, but something quieter, more vulnerable. He told Richard he'd been thinking about identity, about names, about the gap between who you are and what the world sees. He talked about his upcoming fight, not as a sports contest but as a symbolic moment. Cassius Clay fighting Sonny Liston was also Cassius Clay fighting against everything white America wanted him to be. He talked about his plans to announce his conversion to Islam after the fight, about taking the name Muhammad Ali, about the backlash he knew would come. And then he asked Richard a question that cut through all of Richard's carefully constructed defenses. Why did you really quit music? Richard gave his standard answer. God had called him, rock and roll was sinful, he'd been saved. But Clay didn't accept it. He pressed harder, asking questions that Richard had spent 4 years avoiding. Was Richard happy singing gospel? Did he feel fulfilled in his marriage? When he prayed, did he feel God answering, or did he feel like he was talking to himself? And the question that broke something open in Richard, are you being who God made you, or are you being who people told you God wanted you to be? Richard, surprised by the young fighter's intensity and insight, started talking honestly for perhaps the first time in years. He talked about the childhood rejection, about being thrown out by his father for wearing makeup. He talked about the years developing his rock and roll persona, the brief period when he'd felt truly alive on stage. He talked about the Australia incident, the airplane engine catching fire, the terror that had driven him to renounce everything and try to become someone acceptable to God and society. He talked about his marriage to Ernestine, how it felt like a performance, how he was trying to be something he wasn't. And he talked about the desires that wouldn't go away, the attraction to men that he'd tried to pray into submission but that remained as fundamental to who he was as his love of music. Clay listened to all of it without judgment, without the shock or disgust Richard had learned to expect when he was honest about himself. And when Richard finished, exhausted from the confession, Clay told him something that would echo through the rest of Richard's life. What Ali said. The exact words of what Cassius Clay told Little Richard that night remain somewhat uncertain. Richard never revealed the complete conversation, and Clay, who would become Muhammad Ali days later, never publicly discussed it. But in interviews over the years, Richard dropped hints, fragments, pieces of what was said, and people who were close to both men have filled in some of the gaps. What emerges is a picture of a conversation that was part therapy session, part spiritual counseling, part revolutionary manifesto about identity and authenticity. Clay started by talking about his own journey with identity. He explained that Cassius Clay was a slave name given to his ancestors by white owners, and that keeping that name meant carrying the identity that white supremacy had imposed on him. Taking the name Muhammad Ali wasn't about rejecting who he was. It was about choosing who he wanted to be, about claiming an identity rather than accepting one assigned to him. He talked about how scary it was to make that choice, knowing the backlash that would come, knowing he might lose everything. But he also talked about the freedom in it, the sense of becoming whole by aligning his public identity with his private truth. Then Clay turned the conversation back to Richard. He pointed out that Richard had done the opposite. He'd taken his authentic self, the little Richard who screamed and wore makeup and challenged gender norms, and tried to suppress it, tried to become Brother Richard, a respectable gospel singer who fit into conservative Christian expectations. And Clay asked the question that Richard had been avoiding. Was Brother Richard who you really are, or is he just another performance, another mask you're wearing to survive? What came next, according to the fragments Richard shared over the years, was the most impactful part of the conversation. Clay talked about the difference between religion and relationship with the divine. He said that religion was often about rules, about conforming to what other people said God wanted, about suppressing parts of yourself that made religious authorities uncomfortable. But a real relationship with God, Clay argued, was about becoming more fully yourself, about expressing the gifts and qualities that were innate to who you were. If God made little Richard with the ability to perform, with the charisma that could move audiences, with the gender fluidity that challenged conventional categories, then suppressing those things wasn't serving God, it was rejecting what God had created. Richard would later say that this idea hit him like a revelation and a terror at the same time. A revelation because it offered a way out of the impossible bind he'd been in, trying to choose between his authentic self and his relationship with God. A terror because accepting it meant admitting that the last 4 years of his life, the marriage to Ernestine, the gospel career, the theological study, might all have been a mistake, a running away from himself disguised as running toward God. Clay went further. He talked about the entertainment industry, about how it was built on exploitation, particularly exploitation of black performers. He pointed out that white artists were making millions covering Little Richard's songs, sanitizing them for white audiences, while Richard himself saw relatively little financial return. By trying to be respectable, by abandoning rock and roll, Richard wasn't just suppressing himself, he was also allowing the theft of his creative legacy to go unchallenged. The world needed Little Richard, Clay argued, not Brother Richard. The world needed the authentic, unfiltered, gender-bending, convention-challenging performer who'd helped create rock and roll. And then Clay said something that Richard would quote in various forms for the rest of his life. The exact wording varied in different tellings, but the essence was this: God didn't make a mistake when he made you. The mistake is thinking you have to be someone else to deserve love. From God, from yourself, from anybody. You can't pray away who you are. You can only decide whether to hide it or honor it. The dawn revelation. By the time the sun started rising over Miami Beach, both men had been transformed by the conversation. For Clay, talking with Richard had clarified something about his own upcoming transformation. He'd been nervous about announcing his conversion to Islam, worried about the backlash, questioning whether he was ready, but seeing Richard's pain, seeing what happened when you tried to suppress your authentic self for the sake of social acceptance, strengthened Clay's resolve. He would fight Liston, he would win, and he would announce his new name and his new faith no matter what anyone said. The risk of being himself was worth it, because the alternative, being who others wanted him to be, was a kind of death. For Richard, the conversation was even more disruptive. He didn't immediately abandon his gospel career or leave his marriage. Change rarely happens that quickly, especially when you've built your entire life around a particular identity. But something had shifted fundamentally. Clay had given Richard permission to question the narrative he'd been living, the narrative that said his true self was sinful, that his desires needed to be suppressed, that redemption meant becoming someone completely different. As they stood up to leave, Clay embraced Richard, held him in a way that felt paternal despite Clay being 9 years younger. And he said one more thing, something Richard remembered clearly decades later. In a few days I'm going to stop being Cassius Clay. I'm going to become Muhammad Ali. It's going to cost me everything. The endorsements, maybe the title, probably my freedom eventually. But I'm going to do it anyway, because I'd rather be myself and suffer than be somebody else and be comfortable. You need to figure out who you really are, Richard, and then you need to have the courage to be that person, no matter what it costs. Richard left that conversation shaken, uncertain, but also feeling something he hadn't felt in 4 years, hope that maybe there was a way to be himself and still be worthy of love, of God, of existence. It would take time for that hope to translate into action. Richard didn't immediately return to rock and roll. He didn't immediately leave Ernestine. He spent another year trying to make the gospel career work, trying to convince himself that Clay was wrong, that suppression was the same as salvation. But the seed had been planted, and over the next few years, as Richard watched Muhammad Ali pay the price for authenticity, losing his boxing title, facing prosecution for refusing the draft, becoming the most hated athlete in America for a time, Richard began to understand what Clay had been trying to tell him. Authenticity has a cost, but so does suppression, and only one of those costs leads to actually living rather than just surviving. the return to rock and roll. By 1964, Richard was performing rock and roll again, not in America at first. The market there was too risky, the judgment too intense, but in England, where a new generation of rock bands were worshipping Little Richard as a founding father. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, all of them cited Little Richard as an influence. All of them had studied his performance style, his vocal techniques, his gender-bending charisma, and they wanted to meet him, to learn from him, to pay tribute to the man who'd helped create the music they loved. Richard's return to rock and roll wasn't clean or linear. He still struggled with guilt, still oscillated between embracing his identity and renouncing it. He would perform rock and roll for a while, then feel guilty and return to gospel. He would separate from Ernestine, then try to reconcile. The pattern would continue for decades, the push and pull between authenticity and acceptability, between being Little Richard and being who he thought he should be. But something was different after the conversation with Clay. Richard now had a framework for understanding his struggle. It wasn't just personal weakness or spiritual failure. It was the collision between his authentic self and a society that demanded conformity. And every time Richard felt himself sliding back into suppression, into trying to be Brother Richard instead of Little Richard, he would remember what Clay had said: God didn't make a mistake when he made you. The influence went both ways. As Muhammad Ali's career progressed, as he became more radicalized, more willing to sacrifice everything for his principles, he would occasionally reference conversations with artists and performers who'd helped him understand the price of authenticity. Though he rarely named Richard specifically, people close to both men believe that the February conversation influenced Ali's thinking about identity and courage. Seeing Richard's pain had strengthened Ali's resolve to be himself no matter the cost. The cycles of identity. Little Richard never fully resolved the tension between his authentic self and his religious faith. Even in his final years, he would give interviews where he condemned homosexuality and claimed he'd been cured, then give other interviews where he talked about his attractions to men and his gender fluidity. The split that began when his father threw him out as a teenager, that was reinforced by a lifetime of rejection and conditional acceptance, never fully healed. But what the conversation with Muhammad Ali gave Richard was a different way of understanding that split. Instead of seeing it as a failure, his inability to fully suppress his queerness, his inability to be the respectable Christian he thought he should be, Richard began to see it as a kind of integrity. The fact that he couldn't fully deny who he was, even when he tried, even when it would have been easier, was a sign that his authentic self was too powerful to be completely suppressed. This reframing didn't make Richard's life easier. He still struggled with guilt and shame. He still hurt people, Ernestine, other partners, himself, in his attempts to navigate between authenticity and acceptability. He still made choices that prioritized survival over truth, but he also created some of the most influential music in American history, influenced generations of performers who found permission in his gender-bending style, and ultimately helped expand what was possible in terms of gender expression and sexual identity in popular culture. Muhammad Ali, for his part, paid an enormous price for the choice he made. He was stripped of his boxing title, faced prosecution for refusing to be drafted into the Vietnam War, was banned from boxing during what should have been his prime years, and became one of the most controversial figures in American sports. But he also became an icon of resistance, a symbol of someone who chose principle over convenience, authenticity over acceptance. And throughout it all, Ali maintained that the choice was worth it, that being himself, even with all the consequences, was better than being who others wanted him to be. What we know now. Little Richard died on May 9, 2020, at the age of 87. Muhammad Ali died on June 3, 2016, at the age of 74. In the years before their deaths, both men softened somewhat in their positions, became more reflective about their lives and choices. Richard in particular seemed to make peace with the contradictions he'd carried his entire life. In some of his final interviews, he talked about the February 1964 conversation with Ali, though he still didn't reveal everything that was said. What Richard did say was that Ali had seen him, had understood the specific torture of trying to be someone you're not, had given him permission to question whether suppression was really the same as salvation. Richard said that conversation was a turning point, that it planted a seed that took years to grow but eventually led him back to rock and roll, back to performance, back to expressing the truth of who he was even when that truth made people uncomfortable. The tragedy of Little Richard's story is that he never fully escaped the split between his authentic self and who he thought he should be, but the triumph is that he kept trying, kept performing, kept expressing the truth of his identity even when it would have been easier to hide. And the conversation with Muhammad Ali in February 1964 was a crucial moment in that journey, a moment when someone Richard respected looked at him without judgment and said, "You don't have to be anyone other than who you are." The legacy of that night. The conversation between Cassius Clay and Little Richard by a Miami hotel pool in the early hours of February 21, 1964, didn't solve either man's problems. Clay still had to fight Liston, still had to announce his conversion to Islam, and face the massive backlash that followed. Richard still had to navigate the impossible terrain between his authentic self and societal expectations. Both men would continue to struggle, to make mistakes, to hurt people and be hurt in turn. But what that conversation did was create a moment of recognition between two people who understood something most people don't, that being yourself in a world that demands conformity is an act of courage that comes with a price, and that sometimes the price is worth paying. Not because it makes life easier, it doesn't. Not because it leads to universal acceptance, it won't. But because living a lie, no matter how comfortable, is its own kind of death. When you listen to Little Richard's music now, when you watch footage of him performing in full makeup, screaming into microphones, moving in ways that defied easy categorization as masculine or feminine, you're hearing and seeing someone who refused to be fully suppressed. Yes, he struggled. Yes, he contradicted himself. Yes, he hurt people, including himself. But he also created something revolutionary. Something that gave permission to generations of performers to be themselves, to challenge norms, to express truths that society wanted to keep hidden. And somewhere in that music, in that performance, in that refusal to be completely tamed, you can hear the echo of a conversation by a hotel pool, a young fighter telling an older performer that God didn't make a mistake, that authenticity has a cost but suppression has a cost too, and that the only way forward is to choose which cost you're willing to pay. Muhammad Ali and Little Richard, two legends, two revolutionaries, two men who understood that being yourself in a world that demands conformity is the hardest and most important work anyone can do. And for 4 hours on a February morning in Miami, they sat together and figured out how to have the courage to do it.